McDermott, and today's video is going to present the first two campaigns, which in fact were the first two actions that were fought during the earliest days of the American Revolution. And that was the firefight at Lexington, and then a follow-on action at a nearby town, Concord. And secondly, the American seizure of the British garrison fort at Ticonderoga. An equally small action, but nonetheless of tremendous consequence, because that's where the Americans acquired the cannon and the other ordnance that General George Washington needed down at Boston to convince the British to abandon that harbor town. Before we get into the specifics of the Lexington action, I think it's important to paint in some of the social and political background. Lexington did not occur in a vacuum. It was the result of a series of events that had started years before. Conflict between the colonies and the mother country, a series of political actions, and some violence that brought these forces together at Lexington. So, first, the battle at Lexington. The province of Massachusetts Bay was central to the events leading to the American Revolution and the creation of the United States of America. As early as 1765, the Massachusetts Assembly invited other colonies to send representatives to protest the first British imposition of direct taxation. The resulting Stamp Act Congress met in New York and produced a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and then they sent petitions to England, insisting that as loyal Englishmen, their representation in Parliament was required before direct taxes could be levied on them. Both houses of British Parliament refused the petition, citing the extra-legal nature of the American Congress, which had not been authorized by the British government. The stamp tax was eventually repealed, largely in response to economic arguments made by British merchants rather than the American colonies. Despite colonial protests, Parliament insisted on its prerogative by passing the Declaratory Act, where they claimed absolute authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases without exception or restriction. So that laid down the law concerning the relationship between England and its colonies, at least in the mind of the British Parliament. 5 years later, the Boston Massacre caused a serious uproar, but the harsh coercive acts passed by the Parliament in response to the Boston Tea Party, which occurred in 16 December 1773, resulted in a widespread resistance throughout the colonies. Because the British intransigence, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on 5 September 1774 and adjourned 6 weeks later after creating a colony-wide association to enforce a total boycott on all British products. And that was a serious blow to British commerce, as the colonies were one of their largest markets. And when the colonies refused to accept or to purchase any British product, it got British attention. The Massachusetts Colonial Assembly also formed a provisional government and soon exercised political control throughout the province except in Boston, which was occupied by the British Army. Local militia were instructed to prepare for hostilities. King George III declared the colony in rebellion, and the scene was set for an open conflict. On 18 April 1775, British Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and 700 regulars set off for Boston on a raid to Concord, following orders that read, in part, quote, "With the utmost expedition and secrecy, where you will seize and destroy all artillery, ammunition, provisions, tents, small arms, and all military stores, whatever," end quote. The flashpoint came the following morning, as their route took them through Lexington, where John Hancock and Samuel Adams had been staying. Those two revolutionary leaders were escorted to safety as members of the local militia began to form up on the Lexington Common. Commanded by Captain John Parker, a veteran of Rogers' Rangers during the French and Indian Wars 20 years earlier, the volunteers' rustic appearance and demeanor could be misleading. In fact, several of those militiamen were combat veterans. Their weapons were clean, and they knew how to use them. When a portion of the British column formed up, Captain Parker ordered his men to disperse. One or several shots were fired by persons unknown, and then the British troops opened fire, killing 8 and wounding 9 of the militiamen. One British soldier was wounded. The British column then reformed on the road and marched on to Concord, leaving a shocked village to deal with its grief. Captain Parker also collected his militia to defend an issue that soon became popularly known throughout the colonies as the Common Cause. Most of the supplies had been removed from Concord by the time the British arrived, and militiamen were gathering in increasing numbers. Following an exchange of fire at the North Bridge, killing and wounding men on both sides, the British began their torturous return to Boston. Colonel Smith's regulars were hard-pressed, and although reinforced by additional troops ordered out by General Thomas Gage, British casualties increased as the day wore on. Americans swarmed the British column until it crossed the Charleston Neck to safety. The British reported 73 men killed, 174 wounded, and 16 missing. American killed and wounded totaled 93 men. The initial action at Lexington was over quickly and could not be called a battle, but that brief exchange of musket fire was enough to start a war. The shot heard round the world had finally been fired, and with dramatic effect. Captain Parker's account of the incident at Lexington describes a prudent response to the British advance. He later wrote, quote, "I ordered our militia to meet on the Common in said Lexington to consult what to do, and concluded not to be discovered nor meddle or make with said regular troops, unless they should insult or molest us. And upon their sudden approach, I immediately ordered our militia to disperse and not to fire. Immediately said troops made their appearance and killed 8 of our party without receiving any provocation, therefore, from us," end quote. Other participants reported, quote, "We, Nathaniel Mulligan, Philip Russell, and 32 other men do testify and declare that on the 19th in the morning, being informed that a body of regulars were marching from Boston toward Concord, about 5 o'clock in the morning, hearing our drum beat, we proceeded towards the parade and soon found that a large body of troops were marching toward us. Some of our company were coming to the parade, and others had already reached it at that time, and the company began to disperse. While our backs were turned to the troops, we were fired on by them, and a number of our men were instantly killed or wounded. Not a gun was fired by any person in our company on the regulars to our knowledge before they fired on us, and continued firing until we had all made our escape," end quote. 23-year-old Sylvester Wood of Woburn, a village some 3 miles from Lexington, heard the early morning alarm bell tolling. And he wrote, quote, "I immediately arose, took my gun, and with Robert Douglas went in haste to Lexington. We joined Captain John Marker's Minutemen Company and watched as the British arrived and dressed their ranks. His account also expanded on Captain Parker's recollection when he wrote, "The officer swung his sword and said, 'Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, or you will all be dead men. Fire.' Some guns were fired at us from the first platoon, but no person was killed or wounded. Captain Parker ordered every man to care of himself. The company immediately dispersed, and while the company was dispersing and leaping over the wall, the second platoon of the British fired and killed some of our men. After the British had begun their march to Concord, I returned to the common and found Robert Rowe and Douglas Parker lying dead. I saw a British soldier seated on the bank of the road, and I went to him with my gun in readiness to fire if he should offer to resist. I took his gun, his cutlass, and equipment from him. I believe he was the first prisoner taken by the Americans on that day," end quote. The British retreat to Boston developed into a battlefield 100 yards wide and the length of the moving column. 19 April 1775 became a nightmare for Lieutenant Barker of the King's Own Regiment. He later wrote, quote, "We were fired on from all sides, but mostly from the rear where people had hid themselves in houses till we had passed, and then they fired on us. The country was an amazing strong one, full of hills, woods, stone walls, etc., which the rebels did not fail to take advantage of, for they were all lined with people who kept an incessant fire upon us. Their numbers increased from all parts, while ours was reduced by deaths, wounds, and fatigue, and we were totally surrounded with such an incessant fire as it's impossible to conceive," end quote. As the British survivors gained the Charleston Peninsula, the senior American on the scene, General William Heath, observed, quote, "Any further attempt on the enemy would have been futile. I ordered the pursuing militia to halt and give over the chase." And that ends the first campaign, entitled Lexington, 1775. The next campaign, of course, is Ticonderoga. In 1775, Benedict Arnold was a small-town apothecary, a pharmacist, and a merchant living in New Haven, Connecticut. He was also the captain of the local militia company, and when he heard of the rebellion in Massachusetts, he marched his company to join the fight. En route, he learned the Americans had placed Boston under siege, but didn't have the cannon necessary to force a British evacuation. Remembering the numerous cannon he had seen at Fort Ticonderoga, a once mighty fortress at the junction of Lake Champlain and Lake George, but now a decaying and poorly garrisoned British outpost, he proposed an expedition to capture that place. He intended to secure the ordnance, which he estimated numbered some 80 pieces of heavy cannon, 20 brass guns, and 12 mortars. After some initial hesitation, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety was persuaded to commission Arnold a colonel with instructions to enlist not more than 400 men, seize the fort, leave a garrison, and bring away the cannon and other useful stores. Before his men could be recruited, Arnold learned Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, a loosely organized group of rowdies supported by the Connecticut Committee of Correspondence, were also marching to seize Fort Ticonderoga. Leaving his recruits behind, Arnold intercepted Allen and his men, and following a loud and acrimonious argument over who should be in charge, the two decided to command jointly. Late on 9 May 1775, some 400 of Allen's men assembled on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain. Commandeering 2 boats, Arnold and Allen crossed to the western shore with 83 men. All the boats would hold. They landed at 3 o'clock in the morning on 10 May, exactly 3 weeks after the shooting had started at Lexington. Unwilling to wait for any more men, they approached the fort to find that the gate was open and the guard was asleep. The once important bastion between French and British empires in North America had fallen into disrepair and become more of a frontier village than a military fort. The Americans quickly subdued the 45 British soldiers and rounded up the 24 women and children in residence. After securing the all-important ordnance, the Green Mountain Boys set about looting the personal possessions of the garrison, to include the store of liquor. No one was killed in the assault, and on 12 May, Allen evacuated the prisoners, sending them to Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull with a note saying, quote, "I make you a present of a major, a captain, and 2 lieutenants of the regular establishment of George III," end quote. As Benedict Arnold's recruits began arriving from Massachusetts, Ethan Allen's men were running out of liquor and beginning to drift away. After seizing nearby Crown Point, Arnold focused on repairing and improving the 2 locations. When Connecticut sent Colonel Benjamin Hindman to command, Arnold refused to accept a subordinate position and retained command at Crown Point until the Massachusetts Committee of Safety ordered him to cooperate. He then resigned his commission and departed. Losing control of Lake Champlain forced the British to make a strategic adjustment to their command structure in North America. When the link between Canada and Boston was cut, what had previously been a single command was divided. General Guy Carleton was initially given command of British forces in Canada, and General Thomas Gage retained command of British forces in North America, which in fact was limited to the garrison in Boston. Following orders from General Washington, Henry Knox, although he had not yet received an officer's commission, arrived at Fort Ticonderoga in December 1775 to remove the ordnance to Boston. He supervised a train of ox-drawn sleds and hauled 60 tons of cannon and other armaments over 300 largely unpopulated miles across frozen rivers and through the snow-covered Berkshire Mountains. It took 57 days of extraordinary labor before the weapons were delivered, and when emplaced in the heights overlooking Boston, the British were forced to evacuate the town. Commissioned a colonel in the Continental Army's Artillery Regiment, Knox soon assumed ever more important assignments. The initiative and ability to organize a successful solution to an extremely difficult set of problems marked Henry Knox as the kind of leader and the kind of problem solver that General Washington sorely needed. The Congress, sitting in Philadelphia and still ambivalent about the rebellion, was shocked when it learned of the operation and voted to return the fort to British control once harmony was reestablished. The insurgency, however, was developing. Blood had been spilled, and events were moving beyond congressional foot-dragging. The appearance of the Americans at Fort Ticonderoga came as a complete surprise to Lieutenant Feltman, second in command of the garrison, who reported he had been, quote, awakened by numbers of shrieks and the words, no quarter, from a number of armed rabble, end quote. He and the commanding officer, Captain Delaplace, lived on the second floor of the barracks. And the lieutenant then discovered that the bottom of the stairs had been filled with rioters, some of them forcing their way up. He then continued, I was informed by one Ethan Allen and one Benedict Arnold that they had a joint command. Arnold informing me he came from instructions he received from the Congress at Cambridge, which he afterward showed me. Mr. Allen told me his orders were from the province of Connecticut, and that he must have immediate possession of the fort and all the effects of George III. Mr. Allen insisting on this with a drawn sword over my head, end quote. The issue of who was in command of the Americans caused arguments to persist for years. While Benedict Arnold was in command of the troops remaining at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, after the Green Mountain Boys and their commander departed for home, the rough-hewn Ethan Allen took full credit in his written account, failing to even mention that Benedict Arnold had been present. He reported in part, quote, "I ordered the commander, Captain Delaplace, to come forth instantly. The captain came immediately to the door with his pants in his hand. When I ordered him to deliver me the fort instantly, he asked me by what authority. I demanded it. I answered him, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress," end quote. On 17 December 1775, Henry Knox wrote to General Washington from Lake George, New York, describing the difficulty of transporting the cannon. Quote, "It is not easy to conceive the difficulties we have had in getting them over here, over the lake, owing to the advanced season of the year and contrary winds. But the danger is now past. 3 days ago, it was very uncertain whether we could have gotten them until next spring. But now, please God, they must go. I have had made 42 exceeding strong sleds and have provided 80 yoke of oxen to drag them, trusting that we shall have a fine fall of snow, which will enable us to proceed. If that should be the case, I hope in 16 or 17 days' time to be able to present to your excellency a noble train of artillery," end quote. And so ends the second campaign. I look forward to your comments and to hearing your impressions of how the Revolutionary War started, the way in which I describe those campaigns as much as possible from the soldier's perspective. The next video will feature the next two campaigns, and until then, may God bless America.